Well, hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session with Toronto Apologetics. My name is Tony Costa, and I will be your host tonight. And we welcome you along on this Friday evening or whatever time it is in your part of the world. We welcome you. Please be sure to subscribe to the channel. We have biblical scholars, academics, pastors, and other folks, even unbelievers, we'll have them on our show. We deal with current events, and we also deal with various issues related to the defense of the Christian faith. And so we want to welcome you again. Tonight, I'm really happy to have a dear colleague and a dear brother in Christ. We are going to be talking about a bit of Christianity and a bit of Mormonism. And we're going to be talking principally about the evidences that there are for the resurrection of Jesus, and also the evidences there are for the visions that the founder and prophet of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, claimed to have experienced. And so we're going to be talking about those two issues tonight. And I want to bring on the screen Dr. Robert Bowman Jr., and Dr. Bowman, thank you so much for giving up your evening to be with us tonight. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And so tonight, as I pointed out, Rob, we're going to be discussing a new book that you wrote. But before doing that, I want to formally introduce you to our viewers. So, folks, I just want to introduce to you Dr. Robert Bowman Jr. He is the president and resident scholar of Faith Thinkers. He is an evangelical Christian apologist, biblical scholar, author, editor, and lecturer for over 10 years. He, from 2008 to 2018, he served as the executive director at the Institute for Religious Research, based in Cedar Springs, Michigan. And he has lectured on biblical studies, religion, apologetics at Biola University, Cornerstone University, and New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. And Dr. Bowman is also an author of over 60 articles and the author and co-author of 14 books, including Putting Jesus in His Place, which is now going into its second edition, a book that I would highly recommend because it's filled with a lot of very helpful information. And he's also authored a number of other books related to the issue of apologetics. Dr. Bowman holds the MA and PhD degrees in biblical studies from Fuller Theological Seminary and the South African Theological Seminary. And he is widely regarded as the leading evangelical scholar addressing the uses interpretation of the Bible by Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. And so, folks, if you have any more, if you want more information, I've placed all that information in the description box. I've also placed a link to Dr. Bowman's book that we're going to be discussing tonight. So Rob, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this new book. I think it was released last March, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it was released last spring. The timing of that particular release was intentional because last spring marked the 200-year anniversary of Joseph Smith's first vision, according to the standard claims and teachings of the LDS Church. In the spring of 1820, Joseph Smith went into the woods to pray in order to find out what church to join. And he was blessed with a vision or an encounter directly with God the Father and Jesus Christ appearing to him in bodily form and telling him not to join any of the churches because they were all wrong. And this is regarded as the foundational event of the Latter-day Saint restoration. LDS prophets and apostles have routinely stated that this is the second greatest event in human history, only after the resurrection of Christ. So it is an extremely important event in Mormon thought. And the book addresses the question, did this happen? What about other visions that Joseph had, his other encounters with supernatural beings, most important of which would be the numerous appearances of the angel Moroni to Joseph Smith in regards to the Book of Mormon. But there were some other visions as well. And so What the book does is it compares the historical evidence pertaining to those alleged visions with the historical evidence pertaining to the resurrection and appearances of Jesus Christ found in the New Testament. Now, the method that is applied is the same in both cases. I don't engage in any special treatment with regards to New Testament Christianity as distinguished from the LDS visions. I treat them the same. I look at them as historical questions. I don't assume a particular theology or theological critique of Mormonism. Even though I do hold to a theological critique of Mormonism, that's not the focus of the book. The focus is simply on what can we determine using the same methods of historical inquiry when we look at the evidences for Jesus' death and resurrection in the New Testament. What can we determine with regards to the evidence for or against Joseph Smith's visions? And what I conclude in the book, what I argue in the book, is that we have astonishingly good evidence for the one, and we have actually pretty strong evidence against the other. And so the reason for the book, if I could just explain this, is that ever since Joseph Smith himself, Mormons have been making this comparison between the two, and specifically between Paul and Joseph. In his history, which is excerpted in one of the LDS scriptures called Joseph Smith History, Joseph Smith claimed that he had been persecuted over the first vision account the same way Paul was persecuted for claiming that he had seen the risen Christ. Ever since then, Mormons have been making this comparison between Joseph and Paul. They've essentially been asking, if you can believe Paul, why can't you believe Joseph? Well, this book is an answer to that question.
Wow. Well, that's a very, very interesting thesis. And of course, I think a lot of our viewers would benefit from this book because Mormon missionaries, of course, are well, they're one of the most friendliest folks you'll ever meet. I've always said that they're like something out of Happy Days. They just seem just very clean and wholesome. But I think our viewers would benefit from a book like that. So when we look at the resurrection of Jesus, Rob, I mean, we're dealing with something that's 2,000 years ago. And when we think about the Joseph Smith events that are purported by the LDS Church, we're looking at something at the beginning of the 19th century, the 1820s and so forth. And so some folks would probably look at that and they would think that you would assume that you would have a lot more access to more reliable information, because let's face it, the beginning of Mormonism is relatively early in our history. It's not ancient history. It's still within the past 200 years.
Right.
And so isn't it interesting? It's quite interesting that we would have more evidence for a first century event than we would for an early 19th century event.
Well, it's not so much that we have more, although we do have more, but that we have better evidence. And that includes quantity, but it's also quality. One of the things that what I argue in this book is that as people will go through it, they'll see this, that we have good evidence for Jesus' death and resurrection and no evidence against it. There's no evidence, historical evidence, archaeological evidence, or anything else like that, that counts against or raises questions about the reliability of the accounts found in the Gospels regarding Jesus' death and resurrection. We can't prove everything down to the nth degree. We can't prove it absolutely. We don't have, we don't have film recordings of these events or anything like that. But we have very good evidence for them, and we have no evidence against them. With regard to Joseph Smith's visions, we have very weak evidence for them. We do have evidence for them, obviously. We have Joseph Smith's testimonies. Joseph Smith says these things happen. That's evidence. It has to be considered. It has to be weighed. But the problem is that for almost every foundational vision in Mormonism, we have only Joseph Smith's word for it. And where other people were involved, Joseph was always there and was always the coordinator, manager
Yeah.
of the situation. It was always at his discretion as to when these things happened, who was involved. It was all prearranged. And again, most of the important visions Joseph had by himself.
Right.
But it's more than just the fact that the evidence is weak. We actually have significant evidence against the public events that Joseph said occurred both before and after the first vision in particular, that strongly count against his historicity. So again, we can't prove absolutely that Joseph didn't have a vision because we're not there and we can't see, but we have very good evidence that it didn't happen. We have very good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to various individuals, including Paul, and we have no contrary evidence whatsoever.
Right.
So it's a very stark contrast, despite the fact that LDS apologists routinely try to muddy the waters and claim that the evidence for Joseph's visions is just as good as the evidence for Paul's. That's just not the case.
Yeah, and I would think that the eyewitness testimony, which is an important factor here. I think in the resurrection case we have eyewitnesses, whereas in the case of Joseph Smith, as you said, it's just Joseph Smith's word, and he's the one who's controlling the narrative and controlling the information.
Right. That's correct.
And it reminds me in many sense, I mean, I do a lot of evangelism to Muslims and debates with Muslim imams and so forth. And it's interesting that when we compare, for example, the resurrection of Jesus to Muhammad's first experience in the cave in Hira, in Mount Hira, right, in Mecca, what is interesting about that is that it's just Muhammad's word. There were no witnesses in the cave with him when he said that the spirit being appeared to him and that throttled him by the throat and told him 3 times to recite something in the name of his Lord. And then later this entity is identified as the angel Gabriel. But it's interesting that it's just Muhammad's words and so I'm not saying Muhammad didn't experience something, but maybe again there's no eyewitness testimony.
This may shock some people, but I think we're on safer ground in accepting Muhammad's sincerity in these accounts than we are in accepting Joseph's sincerity.
Yeah, and that's really, I mean, when you really think about it, that's quite a claim, because I mean, again, Muhammad was by himself when he experienced this.
But I honestly don't doubt that Muhammad had some kind of visionary or experience of some kind, and I don't haven't. I maybe because I haven't studied enough, but I don't know of any reason to doubt that he thought he saw some kind of spirit. There's good evidence that he wasn't sure who it was he saw at first. So that's an interesting point. But I tend to. Joseph Smith and Muhammad, comparing the two is an interesting exercise.
It is.
There's actually been a number of books, at least 2 that I can think of off the top of my head, that have been published that have compared the two explicitly. And one of them refers to Joseph as the American Muhammad. And there are some interesting similarities. Both practiced polygamy, for example, but when you start drilling down, you find Muhammad's a bit more respectable in some ways. So Muhammad, yes, he practiced polygamy, but it was already common in his culture. And actually, he tried to restrict or limit polygamy for everybody but himself. So, I mean, it's a mixed, he gets a mixed report card on that. But, in his defense, monogamy was not considered a norm in his culture, and whereas it was, of course, in Joseph Smith's day in 19th century America. And he's deviating from the monogamous ideal and overtly overthrowing it. Muhammad abandoned polygamy for monotheism. Joseph Smith abandoned monotheism Muhammad abandoned polytheism for monotheism. Joseph abandoned monotheism for polytheism.
Yeah.
If I'm grading them theologically, I have to give Muhammad better marks than Joseph Smith.
Yeah. And also both were allegedly illiterate. So
Yes,
Muhammad
the
was,
same. You get the same kinds of. This is a very good point, Tony. You get the same kinds of arguments from Mormons in defending Joseph Smith and arguing that the Book of Mormon has to be the Word of God, because Joseph was an illiterate farm boy, and he was, he didn't get past the third grade, and he couldn't write a complete sentence, and he never read a book in his life except he read parts of the Bible, and so anything in the Book of Mormon that's in any way impressive or literate or creative or anything like that, it was beyond him. Well, you get the same kinds of arguments from Muslim apologists in defending the Quran, that the Quran is this great work of literature, which I don't know that I'm qualified to judge an Arabic text from the 7th century as whether it's good literature or not, but that it was beyond him. And it's interesting. We never find this kind of argument ever within the Bible or in early Christianity regarding the Bible.
right.
The biblical authors are all understood to be from various backgrounds and various degrees of educational accomplishments or intellectual accomplishments. Everything from farmers to scholars like Paul.
Right.
But no one ever has argued Paul's writings must be inspired because there's no way he could have written them.
Right. Right.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
There is a significant, if this is hopefully not too much of a deviation, but there's a significant issue in the study of scriptures as to what people mean by inspiration. And Christians themselves in the past have often thought of inspiration as a kind of divine dictation.
Yeah.
God sort of whispers in the ears of the prophets or the apostles what they're supposed to write down, and they're just taking dictation.
Yeah.
And it used to be that the Greek of the New Testament was so different from Plato and Aristotle and all those guys that some people said, well, this is kind of Holy Ghost Greek.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we now know better. And actually the prevailing way that most scholars, evangelical scholars, Bible-believing scholars, think of biblical inspiration is something comparable to the incarnation. In the incarnation, Christ is fully divine and fully human. In inspiration, the Bible is fully human and fully divine. That is, it's the work of real people in real situations, using their language, their idioms, speaking in their cultural frames of reference, and yet it's superintended by the Holy Spirit in such a way that it communicates divine truth infallibly. But it's not the greatest literature ever. Some of the books of the Bible are great works of literature. The book of Job is a great work of literature. Paul's letter to the Galatians, not so much. It wasn't intended to be. It was meant to be a letter dashed off to a church or a group of churches in pastoral and theological crisis. Most people don't think of other books of the Bible as great works of literature. Some of them are, and better than people have said. We now realize that, for example, the Gospel of Mark is actually very well written. The Greek may be rough, but the composition overall is quite remarkable and quite well done. But the point still remains that no one has ever argued the books of the Bible must be divinely inspired because of how great they are, humanly speaking. This is an argument that Muslims make about the Quran, Mormons make about the Book of Mormon, New Agers make about A Course in Miracles, and on it goes. It's an unbiblical and untheistic way of thinking about inspiration.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And of course, the Book of Mormon is replete with errors. And from its first 1830 edition, which I had a chance to look at the University of Toronto Library, and of course, the English was atrocious. You could see that Joseph Smith was really bad with English. Not that he was illiterate, but he wasn't the smartest, the sharpest tool in the shed. But of course, the Tanners did a great job of tracking all those changes that occurred in the Book of Mormon. And yet,
it clearly was not divinely dictated.
No, and yet Joseph Smith said it was the most correct book ever written, and in it is the fullness of the gospel. And obviously that's certainly not the case. Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, Robert?
What I try to do in this book is I try to go back behind the texts of the Mormon scriptures, and in particular the Book of Mormon, because it's the foundational text of Mormonism, and this little book that many people don't even know about called Joseph Smith History, which is in the LDS scripture canon called The Pearl of Great Price.
Right.
It's a very short little book. You can read it in 10 minutes or something. And it is Joseph Smith's account of his foundational visions. The first vision that I've already mentioned, where he saw God the Father and Jesus Christ in the spring of 1820. The various appearances of the angel Moroni to show him and then give him custody of the gold plates from which he allegedly translated the Book of Mormon. The actual visionary experience that Joseph supposedly had when he was translating the plates. And then later on, the appearances of John the Baptist and of Peter, James, and John to Joseph and his associate Oliver Cowdery in order to confer on them the LDS priesthood orders.
Right.
Without these events, Mormonism would not exist.
Right.
And Joseph Smith lays all this out in a narrative in one short book that you can read, and like I said, in 10 minutes, it makes all these claims. If these things happened, then Mormonism is true. If they really were God and Jesus and Moroni and John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John, if those beings actually appeared to Joseph Smith, then we should accept Mormonism. If we have good reason to think that they didn't, then the LDS religion rests on a foundation of error.
Right.
Whatever one may think of the books,
right,
that Joseph produced, the whole story is flawed if those things didn't happen.
Right. And so, in the case of the first vision, as it's known, the first vision. The number one problem we have is it's just Joseph's words. It's not, there were no witnesses. It was just Joseph. And so it's taken his word. Now people can have experiences. One of the most difficult things, as you know, Rob, is you can't disprove someone had an experience.
Right.
That's one of the most difficult things that we can disprove, because it's a subjective reality that the person has experienced. But in the case of the first vision, there's different versions of the first vision. In other words, the standard authoritative first vision that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints puts out is that Joseph went into the woods and that two personages appeared to him, and there was God the Father, God the Son, and the Father pointed to the Son and said, "Listen to him," etc. There are other versions of that event that did not involve God the Father and Jesus Christ. Can you maybe? Yes. I don't know if you wrote in that in your book, but
I did. So there are quite a number of different accounts that come from Joseph or later on from his associates about the first vision. And some of them are quite repetitive of what we have in the official account, with some very minor variations, so we don't need to get too exercised over those. But the accounts that preceded the official account are of great interest. And there's a couple of brief references to conversations that Joseph had with individuals about the first vision that were recorded in his journal that took place in 1835. Those are of interest. There's an account from Oliver Cowdery that was published in a Mormon newspaper around the same time that he said was based on what Joseph told him, and that's of interest. And then most significantly, there's an account that was written in Joseph's own handwriting, probably in 1832, which is even a few years earlier, and that was then quietly shelved, put away, and forgotten about by essentially everybody except the people that had lock and key on it, until the 1960s. And this 1832 account is the one that really has caused a lot of problems in the LDS Church, because it has clear discrepancies between that account and the official account that was written in 1838. I'm throwing a lot of dates here, and some people are going to get lost here. So just remember, Joseph allegedly had this experience in 1820. The Book of Mormon was published 10 years later in 1830. That's when he also founded the LDS Church, as it later became known, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then over the next 8-9 years or so, Joseph produced a number of accounts of this first vision that had allegedly happened in 1820. And the most significant of those would be the canonical account that's in Joseph Smith history that was first written in 1838. And then this lost draft of his history that was rediscovered in the 1960s, that was written in 1832, and is the one account that's in Joseph's own handwriting. And it clearly contradicts, or at least is in serious tension with, the official account on a number of issues, and there's two that really stand out. And these are not hard to understand. You've already mentioned that in the official account, Joseph saw the Father and the Son, two personages. And the first personage is pretty important, right? God the Father.
Yep.
In the 1832 account, the one that just got found in the 60s, Joseph only reports having seen the Lord, that is Jesus. We know he means Jesus because the Lord tells him, I was crucified for the sins of the world. So that's got to be the Son.
Right.
And nobody disputes that. So the account does not refer to the Father or to God as someone distinguished from the Lord in any way, despite the efforts of some LDS apologists to read the Father into the text. He's just not there. Now, this is a discrepancy, but not a flat contradiction, right? Because it just doesn't mention the Father. It doesn't say the Father wasn't there. So to be fair, this isn't a logical or deductive contradiction, but it is a discrepancy. It's a rather significant one, because Mormonism historically has understood Joseph seeing the Father as a distinct personage alongside the Son as of monumental theological significance.
Right.
So if that didn't happen, that's pretty doggone important.
Yeah.
The analogy that I like to use is, imagine if you went to Washington, D.C., and you saw the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States, and you came back and you told people years later, started talking about how you had seen the Vice President. And the Vice President said this, and the Vice President said that, and you're talking about the Vice President. And then several years later, you start telling a new story in which the President was also there when you saw the Vice President. Well, now something's odd here, because you would think that if you'd seen the President of the United States, that would be the number one thing you would be telling people.
Sure.
The President of the United States, you know. So there's something awfully weird about Joseph omitting that fact from the 1832 account. There's other reasons to think this isn't an anomaly or a goof. The second the problem with the 1832 account as compared to the official account in the Mormon scripture is that Joseph, this will take a little bit of narrating, but it's very important. In the 1838 account that's published in the LDS scriptures, Joseph was caught up in a revival movement. He had kind of a conversion experience of some kind. He wanted to join the church, but he didn't know which church to join. So he went into the woods to pray, to ask God which of the denominations he should join, assuming that one of them was correct. And he was told, don't join any of them. Joseph had it narrowed down to three, by the way, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists. I'm afraid the Baptists came in a distant third in his thinking. And he was partial to the Methodists, as he himself says. I'm not making something up or putting something up. He admits that. He was partial to the Methodists, but he didn't think they were right either, and he was confused about it, according to the official account. So he didn't know which church to join, but he had it narrowed kind of down to those three, as probably the only ones in town. And but the key point here is, according to that official account, he did not know which church to join. He thought one of them might be right, but he didn't know which one, and he wanted to know from God which church to join.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1832 account, Joseph says he had been reading the New Testament. And reading the New Testament, he had come to the conclusion that there was no true church on the earth. He couldn't associate with any of them. He couldn't find salvation in any of them. And he despaired of his own personal salvation. And so he went into the woods to pray, to ask God, not which church to join, because he already knew not to join any of them, but how he could be saved and forgiven of his sins.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a flat that's not just a discrepancy, it's a flat contradiction. Either he knew that all the churches were wrong before he prayed, or he didn't. And so that's a very significant discrepancy. Now, keep in mind, both of these accounts come from the same author, the witness himself, who says he alone had this experience. Merely 6 years apart, he tells two radically different versions of the story that have one at least serious discrepancy, whether the father appeared or not,
Right.
and one flat contradiction, whether Joseph already had decided not to join any of the churches, that they were all wrong before he prayed. Now, associated with this discrepancy is that the important detail that in the official account, what precipitated Joseph's prayer was a revival going on in his hometown of Palmyra, actually kind of a twin villages of Palmyra and Manchester. And because of this revival, the churches were fighting among themselves as to who was going to get the converts. I don't know exactly what kind of fighting we're talking about, but they were vying for converts and all insisting that they were the true church or something, which I don't think that probably happened exactly the way he tells it. But in any case, supposedly they were vying for converts out of the influx of believers that came out of this revival. And this is what precipitated his prayer to know which church to join. Now, Joseph gives a very detailed description of this revival. He says it started with the Methodists, and then it spread to the Presbyterians and the Baptists. It started in his own area. And in the context, he must mean in Palmyra and Manchester,
right.
not in upstate New York or America, but he means locally, and then spread around to the region around him. He says a number of things about this revival that we can, but the main ones that I've just told you, we can correlate this particular description with a very specific revival that did happen in history. The only problem is it happened in 1824,
Mm-hmm.
not 1820. Now you say, well, who cares? So he got the date wrong. What's the big deal? The problem is this creates an intractable problem for Joseph's narrative, because there's a fixed date in Joseph's narrative that cannot be moved without just having the whole thing fall like a stack of cards falling. And that is, he claims that the first appearance of the angel Moroni to him was in 1823. And that this event happened after the first vision.
Mm-hmm.
But the revival didn't start until 1824, a year after Moroni allegedly appeared to him. That's a serious problem.
Yes.
It's not an incidental, oh, I got the date wrong. Sorry, it was 1821, not 1820. Look, there are a number of just minor verbal variations in Joseph's writings about how old he was at the time. And I don't make a fuss about those things. Okay, was he 15 or 14? Well,
Yeah.
I don't care. But this problem is serious because it shows that the precipitating event didn't precipitate the vision at all, because it didn't happen until several years after the vision allegedly happened.
Right.
So that's to me, this is one of the biggest problems. The other problem, now Mormons have tried hard to overcome this historical discrepancy. So I don't want you to think that they've never thought of this or looked at it. I discuss their efforts in my book. They actually, when this came to light, and again, this was in the 60s, the Mormons organized a kind of a battalion of scholars and researchers. I mean, like dozens of them, to go into various museums and churches and courthouses and all throughout the area where Joseph ever lived, and scholars to do research and try to analyze all the issues to try to come up with an answer to this problem. So they made a serious effort to respond to it. It doesn't work.
It didn't work.
The other fact that's really important here has to do with what happened after the vision. Now, again, as we've both been emphasizing here, and we're totally in agreement on this, you can't test a visionary claim directly if it's one individual saying, I saw something. Well, how do you, 200 years later, how do you determine if he saw it or not? What you can do is you can test the surrounding public claims that can be examined historically. And so we know when the vision, we don't know about the vision itself perhaps directly, but we know that the revival didn't happen when Joseph said it happened, when it would have to have happened for the official account to be historically reliable. The other thing that Joseph says is after the vision, he was persecuted by all the religious people in the churches in his neighborhood, in his town. They were all they all conspired against him. The pastors of these churches allegedly spoke out against him and got all the people inflamed over Joseph's claim to have seen God and Jesus. And Joseph repeats references to this persecution in his narrative, stretching it out over essentially the entire 1820s. Well, now, if that happened, there might be some evidence for it, right? You kind of think there would be.
Sure.
Not only is there, the problem here is, of course, we're trying to prove a negative or test a negative. Was there no persecution over the first vision? We actually have testimonies from dozens of people in Palmyra and Manchester bad-mouthing Joseph and his family. One up and down, all, just, they couldn't think of enough bad things to say about the Smiths.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of their criticisms we can just dismiss as, grousing or exaggeration or, whatever. I'm not defending their criticisms.
Right.
Well, what's fascinating is that none of them criticized Joseph for telling the story of seeing God the Father and Jesus. Not one. Now, these are religious people. They're church people. The very church people, he said, were against him because they denied that visions happen today and so forth. None of them criticized this first vision story. Now, of course, they all disagree with Joseph's claim that an angel revealed the Book of Mormon to him, because that was public knowledge in the late 1820s and early 1830s. People knew about this claim. Of course, when Joseph published the Book of Mormon, they knew about it. But throughout this period of time, nobody knew about the first vision, not even the people that lived in his hometown. It's so bad, the evidence here is so bad, that Stephen Harper, who is the leading Mormon scholar writing on the first vision today, admits it didn't happen.
Wow, what an admission.
Yeah. Now, you say, well, if Harper is a good LDS, how can he deny that this happened? Well, he kind of psychologizes Joseph's story at this point. He says, well, when Joseph was writing this, he really was being persecuted in Missouri, and the Mormons were being persecuted in Missouri. And the persecution was so bad, it just seemed to Joseph like he'd always been persecuted. So he kind of retrojected back into his account of the first vision, the persecution that he was experiencing 18 years later. Well, I don't buy this explanation, but the point is it doesn't matter, because Harper is admitting that the persecution did not happen in the 1820s.
Yeah.
And it is an astonishing admission, but it's death to the whole historical case for the first vision. It kills the plausibility of the account, because what we now know is the event that Joseph says precipitated the vision didn't happen then. And that the events that allegedly happened because of the first vision also didn't happen. Well, that's pretty good evidence that the vision didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think that would, I don't even think those accounts would pass in a court of law. I mean, a good lawyer would be able, as you've just done in your book, Rob, is they'd be able to sift out all of these inconsistencies and to establish that
Look, if I said an angel appeared to me, you would have a hard time disproving it.
Yeah.
However, if I said an angel appeared to me in 1974 when I was living in Virginia, you would know that I was lying because I didn't live in Virginia in 1974, right? So the bare claim of a vision may be untestable directly, but when the context is provided, you can test the contextual claims that support the story, and you can determine whether it's a plausible or even possible claim. And I think the evidence is now overwhelming that Joseph did not have this vision. Now, did Joseph have a religious experience at some point in his teenage years? Very plausibly. He very well may have. Dan Vogel, who is a former Mormon and is a scholar, kind of a self-taught scholar and author working on Mormon origins, has written one of the very best biographies of Joseph Smith, and done other outstanding work in documentation of Mormon origins. Vogel thinks that Joseph did have some kind of religious conversion experience. He thinks it was something like what we would call a born-again conversion experience. Not necessarily in 1820, but just, sometime in his teen years. And that later on, Joseph kind of embellished that experience into this dramatic vision that he gives in this official account. I'm okay with that. I'm sort of skeptical about giving even that much credence to it, but he didn't get persecuted for having a born again experience. That's that's clear. So nobody would be. So it's rather clear that the vision didn't happen, although something may have happened to Joseph at some point in history. That's not the issue, but whether this kind of visionary experience occurred in the way Joseph tells it in LDS scripture. This isn't just a personal diary account or something. This is in what Mormons regard as canonical scripture. It's not historically credible.
Right. And in your book, did you address, was there another account of this appearance, the first vision, where angels were said to appear to?
Yes. Well, yes. In the journal accounts in November 1835, Joseph, in one of them, I think he did say that he saw many angels, but it isn't clear what these personages are. And I think at the time, Joseph is kind of playing around with some ideas about how he's going to tell the story. And so it's a bit ambiguous as to what the identity of the two main personages are. However, in other accounts in the 1830s, particularly Oliver Cowdery's published account, which preceded the journal diary entries, in Cowdery's account, the first vision is the angel with the plates. There is no preceding or previous vision. And that's caused no end of consternation and debate among Mormons as to exactly how to explain that. Essentially, they throw Oliver Cowdery under the bus and say he got it wrong. Yeah. Which they kind of have to. The problem is Cowdery gives a very detailed description of the revival. This is years before Joseph gave an account of the revival. It's even more detailed. And but it correlates perfectly with Joseph's later account, except for the date.
Yeah.
And the historical evidence showed that this particular revival occurred in 1824. We even have a name for the minister, the Methodist minister that was at the forefront of the revival. His name was Lane. This is confirmed not only by Cowdery, but by one of Joseph's brothers decades later. But the point is that he's remembering the exact same name. We actually have a firsthand account from Reverend Lane of the revival. It matches Cowdery's and Joseph's description in precise detail, except for the date, which is in Lane's account, 1824. And Lane isn't writing this 18 years later. He's writing it, a few months later, saying this is what he's giving his annual report, basically, to the higher ups in the denomination. Yeah. Let me tell you what I've been doing and what's been going on. It's been great, guys. So it's a contemporary account by the lead individual involved in the revival. And when you compare, there's like a dozen points of agreement between Lane's account and Cowdery's account. Again, many of these points are also in Joseph Smith's account in 1838. They all dovetail perfectly except for the date.
Right. Interesting.
And there is no other revival in 1820 or 1819 or even 1818 that even remotely looks like the one that Cowdery and Joseph described in their writings.
Interesting. And even the three witnesses, I mean, Whitmer, David Whitmer, I believe, Oliver Cowdery, these witnesses all later apostatized, apparently broke off with Joseph Smith. Yeah. Can you say something to that, Rob?
Yeah. Now, these guys were not involved in the first vision, of course, nor did they see the angel Moroni. These three men, Cowdery, Martin Harris was the third, right, and David Whitmer. These three said that they saw an angel who showed them the gold plates, but they don't identify the angel, and it's probably not Moroni, but we don't know.
Right.
It's a little bit odd because you'd think it would be Moroni.
Sure.
According to the later accounts, it's Moroni for like 6-7 years that Joseph is seeing the same angel, but for some reason, when the three men see the plates, he's not identified as Moroni. There's probably something going on there because Joseph's earliest descriptions or references to the angel and the plates clearly distinguishes the angel from Moroni.
Yes.
So that means it's not Moroni.
Yes.
Anyway, so yeah, these three guys say they saw an angel who showed them the plates shortly after Joseph finished dictating the Book of Mormon. Years later, for various reasons, they ended up leaving the LDS Church, finding their way back, sort of, in some cases, and others not, but never publicly, at least that we know of, disavowing the Book of Mormon. In fact, Whitmer, in a publication half a century later, insisted that Joseph is the one that apostatized, not him. That the Book of Mormon was true. It was the Word of God. He saw it being dictated and translated, and he was a believer in the Book of Mormon. But Joseph was a fallen prophet, according to David Whitmer. Now, we don't have very much information from Cowdery after the initial events, so it's pretty sparse there. There was some problems between Joseph and Oliver. It didn't have anything to do with the Book of Mormon. Martin Harris is kind of an interesting character. He was Joseph's first supporter outside of Joseph's family. He was a financial supporter. He was also the first scribe for the Book of Mormon. The pages that Martin wrote down for Joseph, he took home and they were stolen or destroyed. So then Martin got fired as the scribe. I can understand why.
Yeah.
But Martin, over the years, showed a shocking lack of discernment, endorsing all kinds of religious movements and beliefs and claims. he fell for a certain sectarian branch off movement for a while that claimed to sort of follow in Joseph's footsteps, and he just, he was a religiously gullible individual, and so do I think that Martin Harris was sincere? Yeah, probably. Do I think Oliver Cowdery was sincere? I have my doubts.
Mm-hmm.
David Whitmer, yeah, I think he was probably sincere. So Cowdery is the one person that I would nominate as a possible co-conspirator with Joseph in producing the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. He was the main scribe. They produced the Book of Mormon in record time. But Mormons were, this is one of those things, we talked about this earlier, Mormons say, it's a miracle. How could Joseph have done it? How could he have dictated the entire Book of Mormon in 2 months? It's an illiterate farmer. Well, he had a literate school teacher as his scribe. Mm-hmm. So, my suspicion is that Cowdery was helpful. Yeah. Beyond simply taking dictation. But, it's difficult to prove that. Yeah. It would be impossible. Yeah. So we don't know, but their testimonies only go so far as evidence. One has to assess their claims based on the totality of the evidence surrounding them. Their testimony is evidence, has to be considered. Their claims have to be considered. And Mormons pound this point that they saw the angel. But when you look at that story, you have reason to be suspicious. Now, again, as I said earlier, Joseph is involved in every supernatural manifestation or experience recorded during his lifetime of any relevance to Mormonism. Mm-hmm. So when the three see the angel, Joseph is there. In fact, Joseph said, they begged Joseph to be the three witnesses. And he says, okay. And he took them out into a private area in the woods, and he allowed them to see the angel and the plates. And by the way, at first they didn't see them because apparently Martin Harris was holding up the show. Apparently Martin was not devout enough and was struggling. Mm-hmm. So he stepped aside. Then the two other men with Joseph saw the angel and the plates. And then later on that day, Joseph and Martin prayed together, and Joseph and Martin had this experience together of seeing the angel and the plates. And Martin's like rejoicing, I've seen, One has to wonder about this because there's no precedent in the Bible or in Christian history for this idea of angels appearing to people only if they have enough faith. Right. And oddly enough, after all the fuss and feathers for 2 years about you can't see the plates, if you do, God's going to strike you dead. It's dangerous. They get covered with a cloth when anyone's in the room and all this stuff. After all that, and then the three witnesses, they have to have faith and have to pray and be sincere, and otherwise they're going to be in trouble and they're not going to see anything. After all that nonsense, right? And I say it's nonsense, but here's what happened. Then Joseph says, you know what? We need more witnesses. So he had 8 other men, mostly from his family and the Whitmer family, sign an affidavit saying they saw the plates, and they actually got to handle them, which the 3 witnesses didn't get to do. They didn't have to have faith. They didn't pray. They didn't have to do any of that. Just, here, want to hold the plates? Want to look at them? Why is that? Up to this point, it was this scary thing like looking inside Indiana Jones's, ark. You get struck dead if you're not ready spiritually. And all of a sudden, these 8 guys are, having no trouble. There's no spiritual preparation required of them. They just see the plates. Right. And again, Joseph has to be there, though. Now, contrast that with the resurrection appearances in the New Testament. We said a lot about Joseph Smith
Sure.
in Mormonism. I do want
Yeah.
to bring this back
Yes.
to the Gospels and the New Testament.
Yes. Before doing that, Rob,
Compare this to the New Testament appearances of the risen Christ.
yeah, I'm just going to add something for our viewers, Rob.
Yeah.
So folks, if you do have any questions for Dr. Bowman, I would encourage you to put a Q in the chat, just a Q or the word question. And then what we'll do near the end of our program, we will open the floor, so to speak, for your questions. So what we'll do then is we're going to discuss in contrast to the visions of Joseph Smith, which are very serious in terms of inconsistencies and dating and so forth. And this is something that historians would do. This is the historical critical method.
Right.
So
Yes.
I don't sense any bias on your part, Rob, in terms of, you're just out to destroy Mormonism. I know you have a heart for Mormons and you have a love for them, and that you're simply applying a historical method that we do with the Bible, we do with other literature, whether ancient or modern. And so,
right. This isn't personal.
No.
I don't have Mormon enemies. I'm not a former Mormon. I don't have any vested interest in this. Now, of course, as an evangelical, if I were to accept Mormonism, I'd have to change flags.
Sure.
But I really approach this subject as best I can in an even-handed, fair-minded way. I try to bracket my own theological predispositions and suspicions. I also try to think the best of people, so I very reluctantly come to the conclusion that someone is lying.
Mm-hmm.
But now, as I said, when you compare Joseph's visionary claims with those found in the New Testament regarding Jesus' resurrection appearances, it's a very interesting contrast.
Yeah.
Because no one human being, other than Jesus himself as a resurrected, glorified man, no human being is in any way in control of or even involved in a majority of the appearances. There's an appearance to Peter. There's an appearance to Mary Magdalene. There's an appearance to James. There's an appearance to Paul, aka Saul of Tarsus. These people aren't present when the others have their experiences. There's an appearance to the 10, I guess technically you might say, because Judas isn't there and Thomas isn't there. Then later to the 11, including Thomas. There's a reported appearance, according to 1 Corinthians 15:6, to more than 500 people at one time. That's an interesting one. There's an appearance to 2 women in Matthew 28. There's no commonality here in terms of anyone that's involved. The 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. Again, Peter isn't there. None of the leaders are there. We only know one of their names, probably because that's the guy that told the story later.
Yeah.
As explained it, for example, in Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. So the evidence that these resurrection appearances occurred is not dependent on the word of or on the controlling or manipulation of any one mortal human being. Whereas the resurrection appearance, if you want to call it that, of Jesus to Joseph Smith happens to him alone. Nobody else has that experience in early Mormonism. The appearances of Angel Moroni are all to Joseph Smith alone. There are what I would describe as apocryphal stories, sort of pious folk tales decades later of people saying that they had seen Moroni, but they're not part of the official story or canonical story, and I think they're apocryphal.
Right.
The appearance, the appearances to Joseph and Oliver, Joseph had to be there. Even the later appearances recorded in Doctrine and Covenants in the dedication of the temple, of the first Mormon temple. There's a lot of people allegedly saw that, but of course Joseph had to be there.
Right.
So at some point you have to say, you know what, this religion is too dependent on one mortal man's participation. What would people say if all of the resurrection appearances in the New Testament involved the Apostle Peter?
Yeah.
I know what I would say.
Yeah.
There's something fishy about that.
Sure.
No pun intended.
Yeah. And if Jesus wrote all those accounts, because from what we know, Jesus didn't write anything. So what we have are accounts of those who saw him, who heard him, who followed him,
right?
Those who were later changed by him, like Saul of Tarsus.
Yeah. Imagine if we had accounts of people seeing Jesus where Peter said, "Hey guys, would you like to see Jesus alive from the dead? Come with me next Saturday at 3:00 in the woods, and we'll see Jesus together." Okay.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
We don't find it's not only not like that. The appearances of Jesus invariably take people by total surprise in the New Testament. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus, God bless them, are running away.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful story. The women have told the men that they saw an angel at the tomb. And the men, from their cultural perspective, rightly so, dismiss the women's story as just, hysterical female stuff.
Sure.
But they were kind of worried that this gets around and people are going to say stuff. Here's these two guys. They're followers of Jesus. They're in Jerusalem. They have heard that Jesus has risen from the dead. Do they stick around, see if he shows up? No, they blow town. Why are they doing that? They don't believe it. They don't believe a word of it, and they're probably scared. So they're going to Emmaus, of all places. Like they have something really important to do in Emmaus compared to finding out if Jesus has risen from the dead, right?
Right.
So then Jesus basically chases them down the road and appears to them. This is not Mormonism. This is not even remotely similar to in Mormonism, where if you want to see the angel, if you want to see the plates, you've got to go through Joseph Smith. And if he gives you permission, and he will arrange for you to have these experiences.
Yeah, it's like Peter Parker saying, you know what, I can arrange a meeting with you with Spider-Man. So if you go to this place, he'll show up, and lo and behold, he shows up because he's a friend of Peter Parker. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I was thinking.
Nice analogy.
Well, you
I
have
might
my
steal
permission.
that one.
Yeah. Well, you have my permission to use it if you'd like. But I also think of Karl Popper made the famous falsification principle, the principle of falsification, that in his view, to determine something, whether it's scientific, it has to be able to be testable, to be able to be proven false or not. And I'm not putting a total stock on this, but what I'm saying is that the resurrection of Jesus is a case of it can be falsified, because all you had to do was, again, produce a corpse, produce a body, demonstrate that Jesus was in fact dead, that he had not risen from the dead. And so the resurrection of Jesus could have been falsified if they could have
been then anyway.
Yeah,
Maybe
if they could find the body. Not now, but they could have, if the religious leaders found the body.
Unless you believe Simcha Yakovovich, then
yeah, that his bones were placed in a tomb. Yeah,
right.
The naked archaeologist, as they call him.
Yes.
But as you know, that's why they had to bribe the guards and say that they stole the body in the night, according to Matthew 28. But in the case of Joseph Smith, it's not falsifiable because it's just Joe's word.
Yes.
There's no witnesses. There's no way to disprove it or prove it one way or the other in terms of experience.
Right. So again, I want to say this. When I first started working on this book, even though I'd already researched a lot of these things, I approached it with the mindset, I may have to just admit that we don't have enough evidence against it to say that we can be confident in asserting that it didn't happen. We may have to say, well, it's not very good evidence compared to the evidence for Jesus' resurrection appearances in the New Testament. But I was kind of surprised at how strong the evidence was against the first vision and against the appearances of Moroni. For example, prior to...
You just cut out a little bit there, Rob. We both cut out.
Oh, yeah. I don't see you moving at all.
Okay, I think we're just having some technical difficulty, folks. We'll get Dr. Bowman on very shortly.
I'm seeing.
Can just hold on. We're just having some technical difficulties. Sorry, Rob.
You can't hear me now, can you?
I can hear you. Yeah, we just froze there and kind of there was a bit of a glitch there. But no, you go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
Can you repeat what you said?
Yeah, these things happen.
Yeah.
I
think
these
the
happen
LDS,
in my house all the time. That's why
the LDS owns StreamYard. I don't know.
Yeah. So when I first started working on writing the book, I didn't really have a strong opinion about the revival issue, about the revival that Joseph said allegedly preceded his prayer. And I was open to finding that the Mormons had a case that maybe that did happen. But I just hadn't researched it as carefully as needed to be for this purpose. And so as I began investigating it and studying the primary sources and reading through the attempts by Mormon scholars to defend the historicity of the revival as Joseph narrated it, I was surprised at how strong the evidence was against not the revival happening, but the revival happening before, in time for Joseph's first vision. It did not. Right. And in fact, the fact that it happened after Joseph allegedly saw Moroni, it was the death knell. It's like, well, that's a slam dunk against the claim.
Yeah.
And so I did try to approach these issues with an open mind of, if you can convince me that the evidence isn't as bad as I think it is, fine. But the evidence is worse than I thought it was.
Right. And even with Moroni, are you aware of the fact that in some Mormon literature, the one account says it was Nephi that appeared to Joseph, a completely different character in the book of Mormon.
Some of that somebody may have made a mistake.
Yeah.
But Joseph himself, in the 1832 account, again, his own firsthand account, says that the angel of God that appeared to him told him about Moroni as the last author of the Book of Mormon in the third person. So this is undeniable primary source, Joseph himself saying this, compared to Joseph later claiming that the angel that appeared to him was Moroni. That is not something that can be easily finessed away. In fact, it can't be finessed away. It's a flat contradiction. It's an important contradiction because it feeds into this whole Mormon theology, cosmology, that God and other gods and the angels and pre-existent human beings are all part of one big cosmic family. And Moroni was a spirit who became a man, who became an angel.
Right.
But that turns out to be a theological construct based on attempts to harmonize Joseph's revelations and scriptures after the fact. And it doesn't comport with Joseph's original reference to Moroni as somebody distinct from the angel of the plates.
Right.
So it's not a minor point. It's a major point. In my reading, I kind of ran out of gas as far as chasing down the Nephi thing as to whether it was a proof of a problem, but it's a problem, but I wouldn't say it's as big a problem as this one. To me, this is huge. And there are numerous other discrepancies and problems with Joseph's story about Moroni, about the angel, that cast serious doubt on its historicity. Now, and this is, by the way, beyond the fact that Joseph was the only witness. In fact, in the first appearance of Moroni, the fact that he's the only witness is a problem, because he claims that the angel Moroni appeared to him for the first time in Joseph's bedroom.
Yes.
In 1823, in the middle of the night, and 3 times throughout the night appeared to him. glorious blinding light bathing the entire house, and or at least the room, and the angel and Joseph having a conversation back and forth for hours at a time throughout the night. What Joseph doesn't tell you in that account is that he shared a bedroom with I don't know, I forget, 3 or 4 at least other brothers.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of them shared the same bed. And in LDS, which is not unusual in early 19th century, colonial, not post-colonial, rural America.
Sure.
Small little cabin or something, not unusual. Anyway, so he's sharing. He's a kid. He's sharing a bed with his younger brothers, and nobody wakes up. Now you could say, well, the angel only appeared to Joseph, and they didn't see the angel or hear the angel. Yeah, but wouldn't they have heard Joseph
talking? Yeah.
And wouldn't this be worthy of mention if this, compare this again with Paul. Paul's companions on the road to Damascus did not see Jesus per se, but they saw the light and they heard a sound, but they didn't hear the words. So it's indistinct, both in sound and appearance, but they have an experience. They see something, they hear something, and they witness Paul falling to the ground and becoming blind. In the case of Joseph and his brothers, Joseph's brothers don't know this happened. They go through the whole night completely oblivious to it. And Joseph doesn't think it worthy of mention. I don't know if that's because it didn't happen, or because he'd forgotten that his brothers were there, or you have to. It calls for speculation to some extent.
Of course.
But if this was the only thing, I would say, okay, that doesn't prove anything. But there's like a dozen of these problems with Moroni's story, and I've already mentioned just a couple of them, and it just gets out of hand how this doesn't look like an historical occurrence.
Right.
And that's not because I don't believe in miracles. It's not because I don't believe in angels. It's not because I don't think angels can appear to people today. See, whenever you criticize Joseph's story, it's invariable. The Mormons will say, well, you're just scandalized by the idea of God appearing to a farm boy and then sending an angel to this kid, and you don't believe in modern revelation and modern miracles and so forth.
Yeah. Strong man.
That's not the issue here at all.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, do I think that it's likely that God would appear to somebody like that? No, I don't think that's likely. But I'm just looking at it as an historical question. I'm bracketing my theological biases. I'm not bringing them into the discussion. I'm stipulating for the sake of discussion that God could do that if he wanted to, which he certainly could. And an angel could appear to Joseph if God wanted an angel to appear to Joseph. So absolutely, those things could happen. Did they happen in these cases? That's the issue, and that's an historical question. And even though we're not privy to Joseph's bedroom or the woods, we can examine the contextual elements of Joseph's story and determine the plausibility of the account based on all the evidence. And when we do that, I think the evidence is overwhelming. It didn't happen.
Yeah. And that's a good point about establishing the context. And that is why, in many cases, we've been able to establish a number of events in the New Testament based on historical context, contemporary writers that were alive at the time, and so forth. So what would this mean for Mormonism then, Rob? If a Mormon is watching this live stream or will be watching the recording, one of the things I want to make very clear to them is, if you're a Mormon and you're watching the program, we reserve no hatred towards you. We love you for the sake of Christ. We love you for the sake of the gospel. But we say this out of love for the truth. If followers of Jesus Christ should be concerned about truth. Jesus claimed to be the truth, and he said, those who are of the truth hear my voice. And so truth is of paramount importance here. So this is not to insult you as a human being, but we are critiquing the documents that have been made available in the LDS Church and those that have come to light. So what would you say, Rob, if a Mormon is watching this,
Yeah.
and this is obviously, this would be earth shattering to a Mormon, because the whole first vision, the whole idea of God being a personage of flesh and bone, et cetera, is all, that the first vision is like a precursor to that truth, that God is a physical being, an exalted man, and so forth. What would you say to a Mormon who looks at this and say, wow, I mean, where does that leave my faith? I mean, I feel like it's in tatters.
Well, I'm glad you asked this question, because it gets to the heart of the motivation for writing the book. I didn't write the book to make Mormons feel bad.
Right.
I didn't write the book to make myself look superior or smarter or anything like that. I don't have to do anything. I didn't have to write the book for that to be the case that there are a lot of people leaving the LDS Church now in droves, because in part they have serious doubts about these kinds of elements of the foundational story of Mormonism. It's not the only reason. Cultural factors are a big influence here. A lot of people are leaving the LDS Church because they're not comfortable with the more conservative values of the LDS Church as compared to the prevailing culture. That's happening to evangelicals too, by the way. It's happening everywhere. Catholics, Muslims. I mean, we're all affected by that. So this is not me trashing the LDS Church because they're losing people, because for that reason, we're all, most of us anyway, are struggling against the forces of the tide of the culture right now.
Sure.
But beyond that, the LDS Church has had a hemorrhaging issue of members leaving because of historical questions about the origins and scriptures of the LDS religion. I don't have to say anything or do anything for them to continue to have those issues. They already have them. The information is widely available on the internet. That's why the problem exists now.
Yes.
This problem existed to a much lesser extent prior to the explosion of internet access.
Yes.
So a lot of these documents were available in the late 60s and ever since then. But in the last 15 years or so, with a few clicks of a mouse, you can find this stuff.
Yes.
And so I didn't write this book particularly or specifically to expose something nobody knew, because the information was largely there. I think I have augmented the analysis of the issues for people that don't tend to approach matters historically, and that's what I tried to do here. But I'm not claiming this is some great expose of stuff that nobody ever thought of. As a general assessment of what I'm doing, that's not it. But rather, I'm doing a couple things. One is I'm addressing the LDS polemical claim that if you believe Paul and the New Testament witnesses, you should believe Joseph. And I'm saying, no, that's not true. So this is, to some extent, preventative measure directed at Christians to say, don't fall for this comparison, because it's not an apt comparison at all. I'm also doing this so that anyone who's in the LDS Church who thinks this is some good argument in defense of Mormonism, in defense of Joseph Smith, will understand why it isn't so. But and by the way, way off in the margins of my concern, but still there, and I do mention this toward the beginning of the book, is that there are skeptics who are now using this argument in reverse against Christians. They're saying, if you Christians don't believe Joseph Smith, why would you believe Paul? So they're turning it around. They're saying, you evangelicals criticize Mormonism, but if you don't accept Joseph Smith's story, well, why should you accept Paul? So I'm kind of answering them as well, the skeptics.
Right.
But the people I'm most concerned about here are people that may have already started having doubts about Mormonism, and they're prey to that skeptical line of reasoning. If I can't believe Joseph Smith, maybe I can't believe Peter and Paul. Maybe I can't believe in Jesus at all. Maybe Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Maybe none of this is true. Maybe God doesn't exist. And what we're seeing is a lot of people who are leaving the LDS Church, a majority of them are becoming non-religious. They may not become atheists, some of them are, but they become completely disconnected from Christianity and religion.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know what to believe. They don't know what they can trust. They don't think they can trust anything.
Right.
And I mean, this is a natural experience. If you are in a religion that claimed to be the one true religion, and then you find out that it's not, you're going to feel very burned, and you're going to be gun shy of anything that claims to be the truth.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to go through a period of questioning and doubting and putting off committing yourself to anything until you've had some time to recover from that bad experience. And so I understand that. I'm not trying to rush or press anybody to come around to my way of thinking. But what I want to say to Mormons who are in that situation, to LDS who are in that situation, is you can believe in Jesus and in the testimonies given in the New Testament, even if you no longer can believe Joseph Smith. It's not irrational to reject Joseph Smith and accept Paul as witnesses to the resurrection, because the evidence for Paul's testimony is extremely strong, and there's no evidence against it. Whereas the evidence pertaining to Joseph's visions, the evidence is pretty bad.
Yeah.
And there's actual strong evidence against Joseph's claims. I haven't said anything about Paul's experience, but let me just maybe
please
wrap toward the end here. I can mention this. Paul was not like Joseph claimed to be. He was not somebody who had come to faith in Jesus and was zealously seeking to know what the truth was about Jesus and about how to be saved. And, he wasn't a pious follower of Jesus. He was a pious opponent of Jesus.
Yeah.
He was a pious persecutor of the Christian church, believing that he was acting on behalf of God in persecuting believers in Jesus. And then he had an experience that resulted in a 180-degree about-face in his life. Persecutor became the apostle. Instead of, and the persecutor persecuted Christianity in large part because it posed a dangerous message against Paul's belief in the exclusivity of salvation being just for the Jewish people.
Right.
If you wanted to have salvation from the God of Israel, you had to become a Jew. You had to get circumcised if you were male. You had to submit to the Mosaic law. You had to become part of that covenant community of Jews. And if you weren't, you couldn't be saved by the God that the Jews worshiped. Paul didn't really say, you know what, I'm going to tack Jesus onto my belief in Judaism. He traded his Pharisaical, law-centered faith for a Jesus-centered faith. He didn't reject the Torah, the Mosaic law. He didn't say it was bad. He said it was good, but it isn't the way to salvation. Jesus is the way to salvation.
That's right.
Now, then he goes out and he evangelizes Gentiles and he eats with them. Ew. This is how Jews in his day would think about it. You don't eat with those people. You know what they eat? They're unclean. He goes and he eats with them. He stays in their homes. He evangelizes them. He welcomes men and women, Gentiles, into the faith, and says there's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither male nor female. There's neither slave nor free, but we're all one in Christ Jesus. That's Galatians 3:28. What makes a Pharisee turn into that guy?
Yeah.
Well, Paul's testimony is Jesus turned me into that guy.
Yeah.
We also have the fact that the entire early church accepted eventually Paul's claim. And so there's, every part of the New Testament agrees with Paul's theology if it doesn't mention him directly. And the early church, as soon as the New Testament books were written, they're referring to Peter and Paul as side by side being, men of God that they look back to as the founders of the faith.
Yeah.
So Paul's testimony has rich, strong evidence supporting it and no evidence against it.
Yeah.
In contrast to Joseph Smith. So what I'm telling Latter-day Saints who will listen is, if you don't know anymore if you can believe in Joseph Smith, or if you've already decided that you can't, I want you to know that you can believe in Jesus Christ, and you can rely on the testimony of Paul and the other apostles and the women who saw Jesus and saw the empty tomb. These are strong evidences. There's no evidence against them. You can have a solid, secure foundation for your faith in New Testament Christianity, and you don't need Joseph Smith, and you don't need the LDS Church, and you don't need the priesthood. You don't need all that stuff. You just need the Jesus revealed in the New Testament, and that faith will not fall prey to these factual, historical problems that are plaguing the origins of the LDS religion. So this is good news if you're a Mormon and you're not sure what to believe, or you realize you can no longer accept the LDS religion.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you have to reject Jesus.
Yeah.
Please don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's our hope that those who are LDS and watching, it's our hope that you do come to know the Lord Jesus Christ. He loves you. He welcomes you with open arms. And he says, whoever comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. So come to him, come to the Lord Jesus. And so we'll just take some questions then, Rob. We do have a question here from Roar. He says, Walter Martin said that the Book of Mormon was stolen from a fiction writer on Native Americans, manuscript lost.
Yes, that was Walter Martin's position. By the way, I had an association with Walter Martin many years ago. I worked at the Christian Research Institute for the last 4 or 5 years that Walter Martin was alive, 1984 to 1989. And so I knew Martin personally and worked there. I didn't know a lot about Mormonism then, frankly, compared to what I know now. But my position on this is different than Martin's. I don't think the Book of Mormon was plagiarized by Joseph from the Solomon Spaulding manuscript that was lost, or by anything by Solomon Spaulding. I don't think the evidence is there for that claim. Now, Spaulding's writings that we do know about and the stories that were told about Spaulding do show that the Book of Mormon kind of fits into the 19th century fiction telling, tall tales, context culturally. But that doesn't mean that Joseph knew about Spaulding or that he had any information or material from Spaulding's writings that got its way into the Book of Mormon. Now, there's still Christian researchers studying Mormonism who think that does hold up. I'm not one of them. Gerald and Sandra Tanner argued against that view in their writings consistently over the years. Sandra's still with us, and she still rejects the Spaulding theory, origin of the Book of Mormon. Other former LDS turned evangelical writers working on the subject also disagree with it, but a few do hold to the Spaulding theory. So I say let everyone, be convinced in his own mind, make up your own mind, examine the evidence. My position is that Joseph Smith is the author of the Book of Mormon, maybe with some help from Oliver Cowdery in terms of the composition. But overall, I think Joseph Smith's fingerprints are all over the Book of Mormon. And you can see the same style and the same use of scripture or abuse of scripture in Joseph's other writings and in his alleged translation of the Bible. Similar kinds of things that Joseph did with in those books we see in the Book of Mormon. So my position is that Joseph Smith was the primary author of the Book of Mormon.
Okay. Yeah. Speaking of Walter Martin, Rob, I got to meet Walter. I was always a great fan of his. He was really I think he was the mentor that really got me into apologetics when I was
Interesting.
A young man. Yeah. When I was a young man, well, I became a believer at 15, and I was almost trapped in the Worldwide Church of God, the cult founded by Herbert W. Armstrong. And it was Martin's book on the Kingdom of the Cults that exposed them as a cult. And I had the honor of meeting him in Toronto. He came up to Toronto to the People's Church, and did a whole week there on the cults. And so it was a great time. It was I think it was a couple of months before he went to be with the Lord in '89.
Wow.
Yeah, but he was such a great man. He was a dear brother, not perfect. No one's perfect, but he did have a passion, a heart for Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and everyone in the cults.
Well, that's a great story, and I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I think that Walter's scholarship was sometimes rough around the edges, and his personality very different from mine. That doesn't mean it's better or worse, but very different.
Yeah.
And I disagree with him on a very variety of issues, but
Sure.
he helped so many people.
Yes.
He brought so much light to bear on these different groups, and so even though I'm respectfully disagreeing with him about the Spaulding theory, it doesn't mean I don't appreciate
of course
his contributions, and as well as the fact that he gave me that position that helped me kind of move into what I'm doing. So I'm glad to hear that story, Tony.
And let me say as well, Rob, that I, as a young student, I really enjoyed your work on Jehovah's Witnesses and the Trinity. That was one of my favorite books that you'd written on Jehovah's Witnesses and John 1:1 and so forth. And also, I really enjoyed watching your debates with the Oneness Pentecostals.
With Robert Sabin.
Robert Sabin, yeah.
I
think you did amazing. So, I mean, I just really tip my hat off to you, Rob, and you've just been a stalwart defender of the Christian faith, and I've been blessed by your ministry as well and your work.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, just wanted to give a shout out to you there, brother.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Just another question here from this is from Bible Care. Michael, how you doing, brother? Michael, good to see you. How do the Mormons explain away Alma? I believe saying the Messiah was born in Jerusalem.
Yes, the usual explanation is for those who are watching and may wonder what's going on here. Of course, we all know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is a village outside Jerusalem. But the Book of Mormon says something about the Messiah, that he would be born in Jerusalem. And the usual explanation from LDS apologists is that Jerusalem is being used here as a term for the district or the region. Maybe in modern terms, this isn't literal, but in modern terms, we could think of it as kind of a reference to the county, rather than just the town or city of Jerusalem. And I think they found a couple of, references in various texts, a couple of texts from antiquity where it's something similar seems to be said. And so they've said, see, this is what's in the Book of Mormon. And it's pretty weak, but it's, evidence or defense of it, but I wouldn't make a big deal about it. This is one of the things that some people may find, difficult about me but this is just the way I am. There's so much wrong with Mormonism. I'm going to stick with the things that I think are decisive, that are really strong evidences against it, and not bother with things where maybe it's just something funny going on that we don't understand. That's a possibility in many cases. I'm willing to concede that where the argument isn't a slam dunk, as I said earlier, but there's so much wrong with the Book of Mormon. This is not one of the things that I camp on.
Yeah, I would agree with you as well, Rob. I mean, Luke 2:11 also refers to Bethlehem as the city of David. In the city of David is born unto you this day a Savior. But we also know Jerusalem is the city of David. And so, yeah.
Well, of course, the city of David's birth is different from the city of David's reign.
Of course.
So that's not nearly as difficult as
right.
This is. But so I'm willing to concede when Mormons have a rebuttal that might work. I'm not going to make a federal case about the reference to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
But look, when the Book of Mormon represents pre-Christian prophets writing in the 2nd century or even the 1st century BC, or going back to the 6th century BC, when it represents them as prophesying, quote unquote, about Jesus and referring to him as Jesus Christ, and saying he will heal the sick, and the lame will walk, and all this stuff, and it's using language right out of the Gospels, and then he will be crucified, and he will rise 3 days later. The Mormon looks at this and says, see how much clearer the Book of Mormon is than the Bible.
Yeah.
In the Bible, the Old Testament prophets are comparatively vague about Jesus. In the Book of Mormon, they speak about Jesus like it's already happened. That's because it had.
Yeah.
And it isn't just that these references are more explicit. It's the way that they're presented in the language that is clearly dependent on the Bible, on the New Testament, and even specifically the King James Version.
Very much so. Including the mistakes, including the additions.
Occasionally including mistakes that shows that that this is a genuine anachronism in the pre-Christian descriptions of the coming of Jesus, and not just those prophets sure were clearer. Now, here's a funny thing. The Book of Mormon, is people well know, many people know this. The Book of Mormon has extensive quotations from Isaiah.
Yeah.
In fact, it quotes Isaiah 2 through 14 continuously in 2nd Nephi without interruption. Although with a few things changed here or there, it's continuous quotation of Isaiah 2 through 14. It also quotes Isaiah 53. It does not start it at 52:13, by the way. That's one of the funny things about it. It should start there, but never mind. It quotes Isaiah 53, the famous passage about the suffering servant. In Isaiah 2 through 14, we have the prophecy of the Emmanuel child. In Isaiah 7, the wonder child who will be called Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace, and all that in Isaiah 9:6, and the prophecy of the shoot of Jesse in Isaiah 11. Of course, Isaiah never calls him Jesus. In Isaiah 53, the language sounds a lot like it's about Jesus' death, but it never uses words like crucify, or no explicit references to Jesus or the historical circumstances of his life or death.
Yeah.
Now, the typical Mormon position is, well, the reason why the Old Testament isn't as clear about Jesus as the Book of Mormon pre-Christian prophets is that something got lost from the Old Testament. The Old Testament prophets should have been just as clear, but somehow in the copying process, maybe the Jews took all that stuff out because they didn't like the idea of it referring to Jesus, because that proved Christianity was true. So they took it all out. Well, we can test that claim by looking at the substantial material in Isaiah that's preserved in the Book of Mormon, allegedly copied into the Book of Mormon from the brass plates that Lehi and his family took to the Americas. And then Joseph Smith, by divine inspiration, translated off the gold plates into the English Book of Mormon. Now, if Isaiah had been more explicit about Jesus than the Isaiah we know from the Old Testament, that would show up in one of those places. I mean, after all, Isaiah 7, 9, 11, and 53 are the most celebrated messianic texts in the Bible, in the Old Testament, with one possible exception, and that's Psalm 22. In none of those places, none of the quotations from Isaiah is Jesus ever mentioned by name in the Book of Mormon. And yet in the surrounding passages where it's not quoting the Old Testament, Jesus' name abounds. Nephi and Jacob and all those guys, they all know about Jesus. They all know his name. They know the circumstances of his death. They also know exactly when it's going to happen. There's a countdown in the first several books of the Book of Mormon to the birth of Jesus. a numerical countdown. It's going to be 500 years. It's going to be 320. It's going to be 105, 60 years, 59 years, 50. They're counting down to the birth of, they know exactly when it's going to happen.
Right.
That's not in the Old Testament either.
No.
So we can test this claim because Isaiah is in the Book of Mormon, but the Isaiah of the Book of Mormon doesn't know any more about Jesus than the Isaiah of the Bible.
Right.
Now, what's funny about this is that if it was going to show up anywhere, it would be in these places.
You would think
but
so.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
Why doesn't it? The answer is clear. When Joseph is copying Isaiah from the King James Version, he doesn't have the guts to monkey with the text the way he would if it was just, one of his Alma or one of his other Old Testament Nephite prophets speaking. He can have them say anything he wants. But when he's quoting Isaiah, he only makes small changes here and there because he thinks if he makes too massive changes, people won't accept it. Yeah. Rightly so.
Yeah.
But the problem is he should have, if Isaiah knew as much about Jesus as Nephi and Alma and all those guys.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite parts in the Book of Mormon is the last words of the Book of Jacob, where Jacob bids his brethren farewell, and then he says, "I bid thee farewell, adieu." And so he uses a French word, a Hebrew prophet speaking French. Apparently,
if he said goodbye, that would be English. So that's one of those things I don't. It is kind of funny, but I don't make too big a deal about that one either. But I guess Joseph might have said adieu, and it was part of his language. So if you're going to translate it into English, I guess you can use a few French loan words.
Yeah.
I will give you an example of a loan word that is a problem. I mean, a really serious problem.
Yeah.
In Matthew 5:41, Jesus said, if someone forces you to go 1 mile with him, go with him 2.
Right.
Now, this isn't some random statement. If somebody bothers you, just go an extra mile for him. This is specific practice in Roman occupied Galilee, which would have been done other places as well, where Roman soldiers would temporarily press into service one of the conquered individuals, from the subjugated nation, to carry their pack for a Roman mile.
Mm-hmm.
And although Matthew is written in Greek, Matthew 5:41 actually uses the Latin loan word million, mile. I was just talking about this with somebody on Facebook,
right,
like yesterday or something.
Right.
So, what that verse is quoted verbatim out of the King James Version into the Book of Mormon when Jesus allegedly goes to the Nephites and he preaches the Sermon on the Mount, almost exactly as it reads in Matthew 5, 6, and 7.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's this? First of all, what's the word mile doing here? Because you say, well, it's just the natural English equivalent. But throughout the Book of Mormon, you have all kinds of terms and names being introduced that are not native to English culture and would not mean anything. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, it's changed in the Book of Mormon in the same passage where Jesus said in the King James Version something about a farthing. And that's changed to some made-up word that's supposed to be a Nephite currency. What's that for? That's for verisimilitude. That's a term that is used to refer to something that makes it look more real.
Mm-hmm.
Verisimilitude. So, and the currency is introduced earlier in the Book of Mormon. So when he comes to that part, he can use that word. C9 is the word. Frankly, it's just a made-up word. Okay.
Right.
So, but if in the same passage, the Book of Mormon preserves this word C9 instead of using farthing, why does it not preserve the actual term that would have been used in the Nephite culture instead of the word mile, which is a Latin loan word that's used in the Greek text of Matthew 5? But beyond that, of course, there's the bigger problem: is why is this being talked about at all when Jesus is speaking to the Nephites? They're not under occupation from a foreign power. Now they're having conflicts with the Lamanites, the bad guys, but they're not a subjugated people, and they're not the specific subjugation of the Romans, who did the specific practice in first century Galilee, would not be appropriate or applicable to the culture of the Nephites. And there's dozens of problems like this in the Book of Mormon. Dozens. So I think, when you start looking at these kinds of details, the Book of Mormon looks less and less like history and more like fiction.
Like fiction. Well, Michael had another question. Is it just the Book of Mormon that has Jesus preaching to the North American Indians, or is there another writing saying it?
In Mormonism, this is the one text. Now, there are stories about the kind of folklore about Indians being visited by a white god that Mormons have appealed to and said, this is evidence that Jesus actually came here, but they all fall apart on close examination. And there's some reason to think that particularly when the Spanish came to the Americas, to Central America in particular, that some of the stories that the Indians began telling, I'm using the term that was used then, of course.
Sure.
The stories that they were telling about their religious past were told for the sake of kind of getting along with and connecting with the Spanish conquistadors.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So how much of it is historical and how much of it isn't is very difficult to decide. There's no evidence, no textual evidence, no writings of any historical credibility outside of the Book of Mormon that place Jesus appearing to the Nephites or anybody else in the Americas anytime in the ancient past. So it's just, now there was speculation in Joseph Smith's day that, and I'll use the more politically correct term now, Native American populations had an Israelite ancestry.
Yes.
That was widely believed in Joseph's day, and he didn't come up with that. But this idea that Jesus had already appeared to Native Americans and started a church here, and all that was not something that had been, that I know of, that had been advanced before Joseph Smith.
Right. And of course, the DNA evidence that was brought forth by a Mormon himself, PhD, who studied genetics, he came out with evidence to demonstrate that the DNA, because Joseph Smith believed that the Native Americans were Israelites, descendants from Israel.
Right.
And the DNA evidence, I forgot the scholar's name now, but the evidence that he brought forward demonstrated that the Native Americans were not Semitic, or rather they were Mongoloid. That is, they come from the Asiatic peoples.
Right.
And last I heard, I think he was even removed from the Mormon Church for going public with this.
Well, the LDS apologetic community has worked very hard to try to overcome this difficulty.
Yeah.
But the way they've done it is very interesting. They've essentially thrown a common sense reading of the Book of Mormon under the bus.
Yeah.
Because the Book of Mormon clearly narrates that the Americas were uninhabited until the Jaredites came following the Tower of Babel, 3000 plus BC. Then the Jaredites died out in wars. They killed each other off. The last surviving Jaredite wandered into a camp of Israelites who had recently emigrated to the Americas as the Jaredites were dying off. And he presented himself, and basically then he just died. Well, then the Book of Mormon clearly claims that the Jaredites died out so that the land would be unoccupied and pristine and available for the Lehites, that is, Lehi's descendant sons and their kids, Nephi and Laman and all those guys could have all their kids there and become great nation and everything in an unoccupied territory. Not only have Mormons abandoned that claim, they now claim, generally speaking, the scholars and intellectuals claim that the Nephites and Lamanites were a small subculture in a small region of Central America where they could practically be invisible to archaeological discovery or to genetic discovery. And that's why we don't find Native Americans to be Israelites, because most of them aren't, and most of their genetic history is not. The problem is that you have to deny the Book of Mormon to save it if you take this approach.
Right.
It's odd. If you read the Bible, one thing that just stands out at you, if you're not, and maybe so much that you don't even think about it, is there's all these other peoples that the Jews are constantly running into and having troubles with. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, etc. It's the Romans in the New Testament. There's these foreign powers, the Hittites, going back into Genesis. I mean, there's so many of them, and they're explicitly mentioned, and their interactions with Israel and later on with the Jews in the first century are explicitly discussed, and they're ever present, and they're explicit. When you read the Book of Mormon, no such thing. There are these two waves of populations, the Jaredites after the Tower of Babel, and a couple of groups of Jews that leave Israel are in the 6th century BC and eventually mix in the Americas and become the Nephites and Lamanites, what we find in the main storyline.
Right.
And that's it. There are no Aztecs. There are no Mayans, and I don't mean by name. There are no foreign powers. When Lehi and his family show up, there's nobody there that they have to talk to, or have to fight, or have to negotiate with, or trade with, or it's
a barren land, just a barren land.
That's right. It's a pristine frontier where no man has gone before, except the Jaredites, and they're all dead. So this is a serious problem for the Book of Mormon that has forced LDS intellectuals to throw out what the Book of Mormon actually says.
Yeah. And not to mention the archaeology is just terrible. No archaeological evidence, to the point that the Smithsonian Institute and the National Geographic Society don't even. I've written to them, and I know Martin did as well, but when I've written to them, the response was the standard response. We don't use the Book of Mormon. We don't believe it proves any archaeological evidence whatsoever.
Yeah.
And yet the Bible is rich in archaeological attestation, whether it's the Old Testament, the New Testament.
Sure.
Yeah.
We can't prove every historical detail of the Bible, but we have hundreds, if not thousands of data points that correlate with known facts from outside the Bible.
Right.
The problem is just so much of it, right? The Book of Mormon has nothing like that. In fact, the best looking data point to correlate with external information doesn't even come in the Americas. It comes in Arabia, which is very suspicious. Why is it that that's the only place? There's this place mentioned in First Nephi called Nahom, and it turns out there's some place in Arabia that has a similar sounding name. And back at that time period, and other things that seem to fit. And when Joseph is describing the travels of Lehi and his family through Arabia, he's very specific. They went in a south by southeasterly direction, this kind of thing. You don't find anything like that in the rest of the Book of Mormon. Once they get to the Americas, there's a lot of language about directions and going here and there and how long it took, but you have no idea where you are. Yeah. And that's why there are Mormons today who place the events of the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, in what we would call southern Mexico and Guatemala. There are Mormons who place the events of the Book of Mormon in the American heartland, or in the Great Lakes region, or Peru, and any number of other places. Those are the main ones. What they can't even come within 1,000 miles of each other in terms of where the main events of the Book of Mormon took place. And we know the exact location where Jesus was crucified, where he was buried, where he stood before Pontius Pilate. We know exactly where the temple was. There's still a wall there.
Yeah.
You know, we know all these details in the Bible that have been corroborated by external evidence. Now, granted, there are some archaeological challenges in the Americas compared to, and especially in the jungles of Central America. But it's not just a lack of evidence that's the problem here. This is a common misperception. And anybody's listening to this, I hope that you get this point.
Yeah.
The problem isn't merely that there's a lack of evidence for the Book of Mormon's narrative. It's that the evidence that we have strongly contradicts and is in tension with the Book of Mormon's claims. So we've already mentioned, the genetic issue and the anthropological issue. The Book of Mormon describes, the main storyline says that these Israelites established essentially a Jewish community in the Americas somewhere and created a great nation, a great population that spread out throughout the land, and they built buildings and all this stuff, and they had Jewish prophets that prophesied of the coming of Jesus. And then when Jesus came, he actually, after his resurrection, he went down into heaven, down to the Nephites and preached to them and started a church there. And for 2 centuries, they had a golden age of culture and faith. They were all Nephites. They were all believers in Jesus. Everybody was great. And then it started disintegrating in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and the church became apostate, and the Nephites and Lamanites fought each other, and that was the end of the Nephites.
Yeah.
Now, we can test this claim based on the archaeological evidence that we have. What the archaeological evidence shows is there's no significant cultural difference between Mesoamericans in the first 2 centuries AD and the Mesoamericans before the 1st century AD. You can go back 500, 700, 1,000 years, you're not going to find any significant cultural difference. If you go forward from the 1st and 2nd centuries, 2 centuries, 4 centuries, 6 centuries, it's not any different.
No.
There is a golden age in Mesoamerican culture. It's the Mayan culture, but that doesn't show up for hundreds of years after Jesus allegedly appeared to the Nephites.
Right.
When the Nephite culture, according to the Book of Mormon, was disintegrating and becoming savage, the Mayan culture was becoming more sophisticated and urbane and cultured.
Right.
It's an exact opposite. And by the way, the Mayans were never monotheists. They were nothing even close to Christians or Jews. Same thing for the Aztecs. Same thing for any people group we actually know about. Now, again, I'm not talking about words. I'm not saying, well, they weren't called Nephites. That's not my point. My point is there's no group of people living anywhere in the 1st millennium BC or the 1st millennium AD that even approximately looks like a community of people that would be Jewish or Christian.
Right.
The evidence is all against it.
Yeah.
They were practicing human sacrifice, bloodletting, and things like that throughout this entire period, not just after, the Nephites culture supposedly fell apart. They were doing it all along. It was, they were doing things that just doesn't fit the Book of Mormon narrative.
Right. Interesting. So I think we have just one more question, Rob. I don't want to hold you more than we have already. Let me just see. This question is not exactly relevant. They apologize for being off topic. What's the difference between Baptist and Pentecostal? You want me to take that one, Rob? I can take that one. Or if you want, you go ahead.
That is far afield, isn't it? Well,
it's far afield.
I've just mentioned this. Baptists and Pentecostals are 2 varieties of Christian.
Yeah.
In a way that, let's say, Baptists and Mormons are not.
Right.
Or Baptists and Jehovah's Witnesses are not.
Right.
Now, Baptists and Pentecostals disagree on a lot of things. Mostly they disagree on spiritual gifts like tongues and things like that. Yep. There is a certain segment of Pentecostalism that is anti-Trinitarian called Oneness Pentecostalism. That is heretical. But mainstream Pentecostalism is represented, for example, by the Assemblies of God. That's the Assemblies of God, as far as I'm concerned, they're an evangelical denomination. So on the essentials, Trinitarian Pentecostals and evangelicals in the Baptist tradition are in agreement on the essentials. We disagree on other things, but we agree on the essentials. We disagree in a united way against the teachings of the LDS Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, and groups like that.
Right. Okay. This is the last question, Rob. By Rory, Mormon apologists have been for years trying to get the weight of the gold in the plates to a weight acceptable for Smith to carry.
Yeah, this is a funny one, actually. The gold plates, we've been given descriptions by Joseph and others of the dimensions of the stack of plates. And if they were gold, and even allowing for a little bit of air between the plates, the stack of gold plates should have weighed in the neighborhood of 200 pounds. Now, could Joseph have run around, with a stack of 200-pound plates if he was supernaturally empowered? Yeah, sure. I mean, he could be a Samson or something like that. But we don't have any indication in the text of Joseph's narratives, of his story, the Joseph Smith history, or anywhere else that ever suggests that he was able to carry the plates by some kind of supernaturally empowered, prowess of strength. So that would be what logicians would call an ad hoc suggestion that, he was able to do it because it was a miracle. Again, I'm not disputing that miracles can happen, but there's no evidence in Joseph's accounts that he was able to do this because he was miraculously empowered. We know from various individuals who lifted something that was covered up so they couldn't see it, that this alleged stack of plates that they were holding was in the neighborhood of 40 to 60 pounds. That's not even close to 200. So the Mormon apologists have had to argue that the primary metallic substance in these plates was not gold, but something else. Now, I'm not going to argue about that, but I'll just point out this. If they weren't made of gold, it's peculiar that Joseph was worried about people trying to steal them for their monetary value. Everything that we have in the accounts about Joseph trying to hide the plates and keep them from being found is that he understood them to be worth a lot of money. And the people around him thought they were worth a lot of money because they thought they were gold. Apparently, Joseph thought they were gold. Now, it turns out they could not have been gold plates. They could have been tin plates. We don't actually know when Joseph had plates. We know eventually it looks like he had some plates because he showed them to the witnesses, particularly the 8, who actually said they handled them. So I'm willing to concede that he had plates, but they were probably made of tin or something like that, most likely tin. Now, where did he get them? It turns out that Joseph's father on his farm had a cooper shop. That is a metalworking shop where they could work with things like sheets of tin. They would have had the tin in that cooper shop on the farm. Farms back in those days, they had to multitask because they had to make their own buckets. Yeah. They couldn't go to, Home Depot to get a bucket. They had to make it. So they had a metalworking shop on the farm, and they had all the different things that they had. And in that metalworking shop called a cooper shop, which you can see it. Apparently, it's still there. Joseph could have, at some point, if he needed to, construct some plates made out of tin. We don't know that he did. We can't prove it, but it just so happens that if he had a stack of plates measuring the dimensions that he claimed and weighing what all the witnesses said they weighed, that would fit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Rob, I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. We went longer than expected, but again, the topic was just so exciting. I know our viewers were really excited and edified as well by this, and I'm hoping that those who will follow the recording will be equally blessed. So, folks, if you are interested in getting Dr. Bowman's book on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus compared with the first visions of Joseph Smith, go to the description box. There's a link there to the Amazon link where you can purchase the book. And if you want to follow Dr. Bowman, I provided his blog link as well. You could read his articles there, really great articles. And again, thanks, Rob, for being with us tonight. And God willing, I'd love to love to have you again in the new year sometime. And thanks again. I really appreciate your time and just giving us all this valuable knowledge.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And everyone, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate your time being with us. We hope to see you again next time. So God bless you all, and the Lord bless you and keep you. And we'll see you next time, Lord willing. Bye for now.